Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. It is exactly 9:21 a.m. South African time. We cross over to the UK and we are joined by UK-based author and journalist Yvonne Ridley to talk to us about 1 year after the Taliban takeover. What has it meant for the people of Afghanistan and very particularly the women and girl children of Afghanistan? And I must say, Yvonne, salamu alaikum to you. Welcome to the program. That we here in South Africa are celebrating Women's Month. We had a public holiday last Tuesday celebrating Women's Day, and there's been a huge focus on gender equality and very especially GBV issues. And for me, it's quite a coincidence that we're going to be now focusing on the women and girl children of Afghanistan in Women's Month in South Africa. 1 year later, we saw that a small group of women took to the streets in Kabul, I think a day or two ago, demanding change, demanding their rights, demanding work, etc., etc. But they were dispersed by the Taliban, who shot their rifles and fire into the air. Thankfully, nobody was hurt or killed in that little altercation, for want of a better word. Was that the right thing that the women of Afghanistan did by taking to the streets, demanding their rights, demanding work? What does this say about the women of Afghanistan, and what does it say about the Taliban 1 year later?
Well, that demonstration said so many things, didn't it? It told us that the Afghan women were not afraid to go out onto the streets and protest. Uh, they did something that many of us who've come to love the country know very well, and that is Afghan women are tough, courageous, resilient, and this is the way they have been for centuries. So if you try and oppress them, they will fight back. And clearly, things are not things that are unfolding in Afghanistan are not meeting with the approval of a lot of women, and so they took to the streets. What was interesting was their style of clothes. There were women with loose veils,
Yes.
women with veils, women with niqabs, a whole array of clothing was on display, which also tells us that a lot of what we read in the Western media about women in burqas and women being forced to cover with veils was not true. The reaction of the Taliban was unfortunate, but how many, thank goodness they fired overhead. I'm sure that they were instructed, not to fire at the women, but to fire overhead to stop this spontaneous display of anger. But, how many times have we seen demonstrations in the West where tear gas has been fired, where people have been arrested? Last year, during a vigil of women in London, the Metropolitan Police behaviour was disgraceful when they broke up a peaceful protest, a vigil for a murdered woman. And they arrested women, pushed them down to the ground. So it wasn't ideal that the Taliban did what they did, but it could have been far worse. After all, we are continually told that this is a brutal regime which cracks down on women. Actually, their handling of that demonstration didn't tell that story. However, the fact that women feel empowered to be able to demonstrate publicly is a good sign. And so, the Taliban, when they swept to power, with so many promises about women's rights and education. They haven't lived up to that so far. But in many ways, they have also worked for women's rights by banning forced marriages. During the 20-year US occupation, there were forced marriages. People were selling their baby daughters to be married off. This has all stopped, which is to be commended. However,
Yvonne, would that be in the same case as in rural areas? Because we do know that in countries like Afghanistan or the supposed third world countries, that when you go out into the rural areas, people are really uh, pretty staunch in their belief systems, and they will continue their traditions and customs. They'll take them on, for years and years, and it's very difficult to get them to break free from those traditions and customs. So what's the rural areas picture looking like? That's question number one. And then number two, the Taliban did promise women and girl children greater autonomy in respect of education and jobs, obviously. But we're seeing that, we're hearing in the cities, obviously, girls are not. Older girls are not allowed to attend universities unless it's an all girl class, and clearly women are not being taken into the workplace, and many women are the sole breadwinners in their families, and this is creating real difficulty for them. Why do you suppose the Taliban are still holding on to these type of rulings, knowing that if they perhaps are more lenient on this issue, perhaps they will get more aid from foreign countries, from Western countries for that matter? Or do they not want to be in need of aid from Western countries?
right, well, talking about the women in the rural areas, I did go out into the rural areas during my recent visit to Afghanistan. I went into places that most Western journalists previously have not gone because they weren't safe to go. I found the country to be perfectly safe, and I was able to travel around with my two guides and without armed escorts and all of the paraphernalia you sometimes see with Western journalists. And I spoke to the ordinary Afghan women in the rural area. I asked them if they were pleased that the Taliban were in power. They were quite pragmatic because they're so distant from Kabul. They've never had any favors, no attention from Kabul. Any money designated for the rural areas was rifled and pocketed by one of the most corrupt governments in the world. But what the women did tell me is, thank goodness the war is over. We want peace. That is what we want. We want peace and security, and we want jobs for our menfolk, which was interesting. And I'll never forget, a few years ago, a woman in Gardes telling me, stop trying to turn me into a career woman, get him a job first, pointing at her
Wow.
husband.
Wow.
So I also, and I traveled extensively around Nangarhar, Logar, Kandahar provinces, right around the south to some of the most remote areas. And I could not meet a single woman who had not been impacted in a very negative way by the occupation years. She had either had her only contact with the Americans or British, were having homes raided at 2, 3 in the morning with dogs, security dogs going through the home, husbands, sons, brothers, uncles being disappeared, homes being shelled. I met one woman who lifted up her skirt and showed me her legs, which were horribly scarred and by a shell which had dropped into her neighbour's home in the mistaken belief that this was a Taliban stronghold. Unfortunately, because the media were not going into these areas, it appears that Afghan forces, backed up by NATO forces, were bombing willy-nilly in civilian areas and terrorizing people. So the women in the rural areas are, thank goodness the Taliban arrived and stopped all of this. So their attitude is quite different to the privileged elite women, Afghan women, whose lives have been impacted, some of them negatively, by the Taliban. But yes, there are old customs, old traditions, which really have no place in the 21st century. Doesn't matter whether we're East or West. And that will slowly have to be overturned and done with sensitivity. It's less than 100 years ago, they were still binding feet in China. And that practice has stopped. So there are customs which should be left behind, and that will again have to be tackled slowly. Now, if we fast forward to where we are today, 1 year on, the Taliban have had all the assets and banks and economy has been smashed by the freezing of accounts and assets in Afghanistan. And, there isn't a single government in the world that could operate and function and perform 100% under these ridiculous conditions imposed by the Americans. So, maybe women's rights aren't their top priority at the moment. When they gave that astonishing press conference to the world in a year ago in Kabul, they had taken control of the country. What happened after then? The Americans froze the banks. You can't get cash in Afghanistan. You can't go to the cash point and put your card in. It'll be swallowed up. You can't. I tried to do some shopping online while I was there, and I couldn't even do that, although I have an account in the UK, which functions perfectly well. You cannot make financial transactions electronically. The things that we do that we take for granted cannot be done in Afghanistan. So how the hell can you run a government with those restrictions? It's like sending somebody out to play cricket with one arm behind their back and a ball and chain on their leg. So
and this, Yvonne, this is directly due to the Americans having frozen all of Afghanistan's assets. Do you believe that if they are given back all their gold reserves and their monies, which belong rightfully to the Afghanistani people, that we will see real change and real progress in the country? And obviously, with lots of governments or some governments, there is a lot of corruption once they get their hands on the money. Do you think that there'd be better control this time around? God willing, if that does, inshallah, happen?
I am really confident that the Taliban can govern without corruption. The one thing that they do have zero tolerance towards is corruption. And this is very interesting because although the economy is broken because of US actions, the Taliban have imposed a zero tolerance crackdown on corruption. And as a result of that alone, the Afghani currency is performing better than the Pakistan rupee and the Indian rupee. So this is quite interesting. You know, this is really something that people aren't talking about. What they're also not talking about, you know, are other things, as I said before, like the end of forced marriages. All the West is focusing on at the moment is that senior girls, as yet, are still not at school. And it's as though that is the only thing that matters in the world. The fact that Muslim schoolgirls in nearby India are having their hijabs ripped off and being banned from schools, the international community couldn't care less about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But the whole focus is on education in Afghanistan, which in a bizarre way, I think is suiting the purposes of the Taliban, because they're not sitting there idle or dictating and oppressing women. They're working very hard at the moment on looking at how they can make Afghanistan a viable country. And the lithium resources in Afghanistan could turn out to be the largest in the world. Now, then Elon Musk said a few months ago in a totally unrelated conversation that lithium is the new oil. And there are said to be $3 trillion worth of lithium that could be mined in that country. Now, then the Soviet, during the Soviet occupation, mining experts discovered this incredible find, but they kept it a closely guarded secret. But in 2004, during the US occupation years, US geologists stumbled across this. Most of it was in the occupied parts of Taliban, where the Taliban were, so the Americans couldn't get their hands on it. And I think that the American freezing of assets has absolutely nothing to do with women's rights. I think it's got everything to do with how do we get our hands on the world's biggest reserves of lithium.
Absolutely.
If you freeze a country's assets, how do they go about doing this? But you know, the Taliban have had 20 years of being out of power to think about what they will do once they get in power. And for the last 10 years, they've been running a parallel government in the south. So they're not, this portrayal by the West of these men in backward men in flip-flops and Kalashnikovs. It actually suits the Taliban that people think that like that.
Absolutely. But they're great minds. There are great minds amongst them. I just want to digress ever so slightly. And let's look at the situation. Obviously, it suits the US to put out all forms of propaganda against Taliban. and obviously the Afghani situation. What they are saying now in a recent press conference is they're very concerned about the security situation in the country. They touch on earlier this week an ISIL suicide bomber assassinated a key Taliban figure, which comes days after a US drone strike in Kabul killed the Al Qaeda leader Zawahiri. So those two situations is creating concern, maybe not necessarily to the degree, it is creating concern for the Western powers, but what about the people in Afghanistan itself? There's also rumors that perhaps the Taliban themselves sold out the Al Qaeda leader who was supposedly living in peace, possibly retired from politics and living in peace with his family, his children and grandchildren. So, what's the story there? Because we got it from a Western perspective. Let's get an insider view from you, Yvonne Ridley.
Well, as yet, there's no DNA proof that the Americans did kill Ayman al-Zawahiri. They've claimed to have killed him about 7 or 8 times in the past. However, I do think that this time they did get him. But at the end of the day, this was a leader who had both his arms tied behind his back. He was, yes, he was a person of interest, but he certainly wasn't a person of any threat by today's standards, which doesn't mean that he still shouldn't have been held to account for all the atrocities he's alleged to have committed. I would have preferred to have seen Ayman al-Zawahiri in an international court and dealt with as we in the so-called civilized world believe that things should be dealt with. But at the end of the day, he was a name. He had no influence. He wasn't controlling anything. He was maybe a figurehead, if even that. So in the terms of politics, it mattered not whether he's dead or alive. It's irrelevant. He was a spent force a long time ago. In fact, I think he did give an interview once saying that after the events of 9/11, both he and Osama bin Laden fully expected to be eliminated in the first year of the launch of the war on terror. So the fact that he was there in Kabul is neither here nor there. It doesn't break the Doha Agreement at all because, as I say, he wasn't a threat. The Taliban had signed up to the fact that they would not allow their country to be used for terrorism outside of Afghanistan, and to be no threat. And that was an easy agreement for them to sign because the Taliban have no history of terrorism in the world. There's just no history. There was no Taliban on the 9/11 hijacked flights. They have never taken their fight beyond the borders of Afghanistan. So I don't think that the spirit of the agreement was broken. As for the Taliban selling Ayman al-Zawahiri out, I very much doubt that. Obviously, it can't be ruled out. Apparently, $60 million of aid was released 2 days after his assassination. But at the same time, that money was probably already designated and on its way before the assassination happened. So I think that a great deal was made of it, but it was a big kerfuffle about nothing.
Okay, Yvonne, that's where we're going to have to leave it. We have run out of time, but what a different perspective to what we're being fed by the Western media. Always a pleasure talking with you. Till the next time, as always, take care, stay safe. Salaam
Thank you.
alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam.
It's exactly 9:46 a.m. News and Views with me, Julie Ali on Salam Media. Next up, we are going to be talking about the 10 years of Marikana, a candle-lit vigil. It's happening, I think, tonight, this evening, in downtown Johannesburg. So do stay with us.